Maybe you still remember the sound of his paws walking around the house. It wasn't tall. It wasn't something that bothered me. But it was constant. It was presence. It was that soft knock, knock, knock on the floor, especially at night, when everything was silent and you knew you weren't alone. Now, pay attention to this. What if that sound hadn't gone away completely? And if somehow, was he still trying to get back to you? This video is not just about nostalgia. It's not just about loss. It's about something many people are afraid to admit, even if you feel it deep down. Because there are stories, real experiences, of people who swear that their dogs have returned, but not in the way everyone imagines. They came back, in another body. And before you think this is just a coincidence, or imagination caused by pain, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at another dog and felt something strange? As if he recognized you, even though I've never seen you? As if that look wasn't new? Because anyone who has experienced this knows it's not normal. And throughout this video, you will understand why this happens. You will recognize signs that you may have ignored. And especially, you will begin to see the bond between you and your dog in a completely different way, maybe even stronger than before. Because the truth is, when a dog comes into your life, it doesn't just take up space in the house. He occupies routine. He occupies silence. It takes up invisible chunks of your day. And that's why, when he leaves, it's not just his absence that hurts. That's what remains. The food bowl in the same place, the corner where he slept, empty. The feeling that something is missing, even when everything is apparently normal. The house remains the same, but it doesn't look the same anymore. And maybe what hurts the most, it's realizing that the world continues, even after your world stopped. If you've been through this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Do you know what it's like to walk around the house and for a second think you saw him passing by or hear a noise and automatically look as if he were still there, and for a moment it looks real. But then silence comes, and that silence, it's not just a lack of sound, it's a lack of presence. Now let me tell you something important. There are people who, after experiencing this emptiness, decided to open space again, not because they forgot, but because they could no longer bear the silence. And that's when something strange started to happen. They found another dog. But it wasn't just another dog. There was something different, something difficult to explain, something that didn't make sense, but at the same time, made it feel. And maybe, what will you hear here today? Explain things you haven't yet understood. Maybe that explains that look, that behavior, that inexplicable feeling, that somehow he is still with you. Because what you will discover from now on, it can completely change the way you see loss, and especially the possibility of reunion. But before continuing, tell me something here in the comments. Have you ever felt, even if for a second, that your dog was still around after he left? Because from here, things start to get hard to ignore. After he was gone, the house didn't just get quieter. She became different. It's not something that can be explained easily. The walls are the same. The furniture remains in place. The routine, theoretically, still exists. But something changed. Maybe you realize this on the first day, or maybe only after a few days, when the penny really dropped. You enter the house, and no one comes running to the door. There's no rushing sound of paws on the floor. There's no good anxiety, as if someone has been waiting for you all day. And the strangest thing is that your body is still waiting for it, automatically. You open the door, and for a second, prepare for that moment. But it doesn't happen. And it is in this small interval that the pain appears. Because it's not just his absence. It is the absence of everything he stood for. He followed you around the house. Remember? Even when you didn't even realize it. I would go to the kitchen with you. He stopped nearby while you were playing with your cell phone. I lay down in the same place as always, as if that space had been made just for him. And now, that place is still there, but empty. And there's something about that emptiness that weighs more than any noise, because he doesn't scream, he doesn't attract attention, he just stays, present all the time. Maybe you have a corner of your house that you avoid looking at for a long time. Maybe the pot is still there, or the wok, or even a forgotten toy that no one had the courage to take away. And it's not because you can't move on, it's because that it still means something. If you've ever lost a dog, you know exactly that. You know how the silence of the house, it's not really silent. It's memory. It is an invisible repetition of what already happened there. It's as if, somehow, the moments were still happening, only without him. And there is a specific type of longing that only those who lived it understand. It's not just a lack, it's interrupted continuity, because he wasn't an event in your life. He was part of your day. And maybe the hardest thing to accept is that there was no complete farewell. Even if you were there on the last day, even if you said goodbye, there's always a strange feeling that something was left unfinished, that there was still a connection. And it's exactly here that a lot of people start to feel things they can't explain. Rapid sensations, little moments, almost as if, for a second, he was still there. Not clearly, not visibly, but present. And some people try to ignore that. Others try to rationalize. They say it's just nostalgia, just memory, just the brain trying to fill the void. But it's not always that simple. Because when you live with a dog, you learn to recognize presence, without needing to see, without needing to hear clearly. You feel. And when that feeling appears, even after he's gone, this touches something deeper, something that is not just psychological. Now think with me. And if that feeling that he's still around, isn't it just nostalgia? Because what some people started to realize is that this presence, sometimes, it doesn't go away. She changes, and in some cases, she reappears. But not in the way you expect. And that's exactly where that begin the stories that no one can quite explain, and maybe have much more to do with you than you imagine. Sometime later, when the pain is no longer as intense as it was in the first few days, but it is still there, present, some people make a difficult decision. They decide to make room again, not because they forgot, not because they replaced it, but because the silence, it was already too heavy. And that's exactly what happened to a person who commented on something that caught a lot of attention. She said it took her months to even consider getting another dog. The house was empty, the broken routine, and everything felt incomplete. Until one day, almost without planning, she found a new dog. Small, still, too calmly for a puppy. And in the beginning, it was just that, a new beginning. But things started to change, in the details, in the first few days. Something strange happened. The dog started following exactly the same paths inside the house, what the other used to do. I stopped at the same places. I lay down in the same corner. I looked at the same points, as if he already knew everything there. At first, she tried to ignore it. She told herself it was a coincidence, but then came the moment she couldn't explain. One day, when I got home, before even opening the door completely, the dog was already there, waiting, exactly like the other one did, in the same place, in the same position. And when the door opened, he looked, not like a dog that was seeing someone, but as someone who already knew, who was coming, and it was at that moment that she felt something she couldn't deny. It wasn't just affection. It wasn't just connection. It was recognition. A silent recognition that needed no explanation. And after that, other small details began to emerge. The way you tilt your head, the way of observing in silence, even the way you react to your own name, as if it wasn't completely new. And the more she tried to rationalize, least it made sense. Because it wasn't an isolated behavior. It was a set. It was an emotional repetition. And maybe you're hearing this and thinking, that's just an impression. It's just projected nostalgia. And yes, it often can be, but not always. Because there are standards that go beyond chance. There are connections that do not follow simple logic. And the most curious thing is that this is not an isolated story. There are dozens, hundreds of similar reports. People who say the same thing. It wasn't the same, but it looked like him. He didn't have the same body, but he had the same look. It was like something had come back. And when many people, who never spoke, they never met, begin to describe similar sensations, this is no longer just a coincidence. It starts to become a pattern. Now pay attention to this, because what impresses most about these stories, it is not the visible behaviors. It's the details that no one teaches. Things a new dog. I simply wouldn't know. And it is exactly in these details which begins something even more difficult to ignore. Now tell me something. If it was just a coincidence, why do these little signs feel so personal? Because what comes next? This is where logic starts to fail, and something deeper begins to appear. What moves people the most? It's not what you can see and far. It's not basic behavior. It's not the fact that it follows through the house or wait at the door. This could even be explained. What really chills? It's the details, those little gestures that seem too specific to be just a coincidence. Things only you would notice, like that way of laying down, exactly crooked, taking up more space than it needed, or the way to touch you, always on the same side, or even that strange habit of staring at a point in the house, as if he was seeing something that no one else sees. And the strongest of all, the look. Because anyone who has lived with a dog for years knows how to recognize a look. It's not just expression, it's communication, it's presence, it's a bond. And when you look at another dog, and for a second, do you feel that look? It's not new. This disarms any logical explanation. There is a kind of silence within this moment that speaks more than any sound. You stop, observe, and something inside you reacts. It is not thought. It's a feeling. It's as if some part of you recognized it before your mind even understood it. And many people describe exactly that. They say the new dog, at some point, look at them, in the same way, just as calmly, with the same depth, with that same silent understanding, as if he knew things that were never taught. And that doesn't happen all the time. It's not constant. These are quick moments, almost like failures, in reality. But they are strong enough to stay in memory. And that's where the restlessness begins. Because when that happens once, you ignore. When two, you question. But when it starts to happen again, it's hard to keep pretending it's nothing. There is a story that made a big impact because of this. One person said the new dog, I had never entered a particular room in the house. It was a place that was always closed. But one day, due to carelessness, the door was left open, and the dog came in, walked straight, without hesitation, without exploring like an animal normally would. And he went to a specific point in the room, exactly the place where the previous dog used to lie. And there, he stopped, lay down, and it stayed. No fuss, no curiosity. As if that space was already his. At that moment, there was no doubt. There was not enough logical explanation, just a very clear feeling that something there. It wasn't entirely new, and it's in this type of detail that many people begin to feel something even deeper, not just similarity, but continuity. And that affects everything. Because if there is continuity, so maybe. The story didn't end the way it seemed, but at the same time, this also creates an internal conflict that is difficult to ignore. Why accept this possibility? It means reviewing everything you believed. Now think honestly. When you remember that look he had, that look that seemed to understand everything, is it possible that it just disappeared? Or could it be, somehow, still trying to find you? Because what comes next? It's not about external signs. It's about what happens inside you when that doubt starts to get too strong to ignore. This is where everything starts to get more difficult, because until now, I could ignore it. You could say it was a coincidence. It was possible to rationalize it. I could move on without messing with it too much. But when the signs start to repeat themselves, when the feeling stops being an isolated moment and starts to appear in small details of everyday life, something changes inside you. And it's not comfortable, because along with the possibility, conflict comes. A silent conflict that many people don't talk about, but they feel. On the one hand, the logic. It's still just a new dog. It can't be the same. That doesn't make sense. On the other side, the feeling. That strange certainty, which cannot be explained, but insists on staying. And the most difficult, it's not about choosing a side. It's dealing with what comes along with it. Because when that doubt appears, she brings something that weighs guilt, an almost invisible guilt, but very real. How to accept this possibility? If somehow betray the dog that left. How to make space for this new bond, reduce the old one. And that stops a lot of people. Because the love you felt, it was unique, it was true, it was irreplaceable, and the idea that another dog can occupy this space scares. But here's the point that no one explains to you. Maybe it's not about replacing, maybe it never was, because there is a profound difference between replacing and continue. Replace, erases, continue, transform. And that's exactly the difference that starts to mess with everything inside you. Because if it's continuity, so there is no complete loss. And that, while comforting, it's also scary, because it breaks everything you've learned about beginning and end. There is a moment in which you perceive this very clearly. P. It can be simple. A gesture, a look, a repeated habit, and suddenly, you are no longer looking at another dog. You're feeling something familiar, something that has been there before. And in that moment, the conflict reaches its peak, because a part of you wants to believe, but the other is afraid. Fear of being deceived, fear of projecting, fear of trying to ease the pain with a story that isn't real. But there is also another fear, the fear of ignoring something that maybe be true. And that's exactly the point. This is where the phrase that many people keep in silence comes from. What if it's him, and I'm pretending it's not him? This is the remaining doubt. And it doesn't go away easily. Because the more you try to ignore, the more small signs appear. But the details repeat themselves. But that feeling comes back. And little by little, what seemed impossible before, it starts to seem possible. Not logical, but possible. And maybe the biggest mistake is not believing too much. Maybe it is. Don't allow yourself to feel. Now answer me honestly. If deep down you felt like he had returned somehow, would you have the courage to accept this? Because in the next step, we enter into something that goes beyond doubt, something you don't try to prove, but it makes you feel. Before continuing, pay attention to this. And if what you felt so far, was it ever about coincidence? And if that strange feeling, this silent recognition, it wasn't something created by your mind, but something noticed by her? Because there is an idea that many people avoid considering, but it starts to make sense when you look at these patterns more closely. The idea that the bond between you and your dog, it did not begin in this life, and maybe don't end up there either. It may seem too intense to think like that, but when you look at the way some dogs come into our lives, it doesn't seem random. They arrive at specific times. They stay exactly as long as they need. And they leave marks that don't disappear. These are not just memories. These are deep emotional impressions, as if, somehow, that meeting was already scheduled. And when that kind of bond forms, he is not superficial. It doesn't just depend on coexistence. It builds into something deeper, harder to explain, something some people call soul bond. And if this is real, so the physical absence does not mean the end of the connection. It just means a change of form. Now think with me. Do you really believe such an intense connection, so full of presence, does it just disappear? Or does it make more sense that she reorganize yourself? Because when a dog recognizes you without ever having lived, when he demonstrates two specific behaviors without having learned, when he looks as if he already knows who you are, maybe this isn't learning. Maybe it's memory. Not a conscious memory, like ours, but an emotional memory. Something that remains, something that passes through. And that's exactly why that some people report the feeling of reunion, not the same, not identical, but familiar enough to touch the same place inside them. And here's the most important part of all. Maybe he didn't come back to be the same. Maybe he's back to continue the link, continue presence, continuing something that hasn't finished. It just changed shape, and that completely changes the way you see loss. Because if there is continuity, so goodbye. It was never definitive, and it doesn't lessen the pain, but it transforms its meaning. Longing is no longer just absence and becomes an invisible connection, something that still exists, even without being seen. And maybe that's why that some encounters seem so intense, even though they are new, because deep down, maybe they're not that new. And this is where it all comes together. The details, the behaviors, the looks, the sensations, not as evidence, but as signs. Signs that the bond, it was not broken. It just changed path. Now think about it calmly. If this bond really continues, so maybe he never really left. And maybe, at some point, he found a way to get back to you. But not to repeat the past. And yes, to write a sequel. And this leads to an inevitable thought. If he came back, would you recognize it? Because what comes now, it's not about theory. It's about what you felt there at the beginning. And maybe it was never just longing. Remember the beginning? From the sound of paws around the house, that soft knock, 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 especially when everything was silent. Maybe you thought you'd never hear that again. Maybe you thought that sound stuck in the past. But what if it didn't? And if somehow, does it still echo? Not exactly the same. Not exactly in the same way, but present in another way. Because after everything you've seen so far, maybe that feeling that and you had at times, it wasn't just nostalgia. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was that strange moment where you looked at another dog and felt something too familiar to ignore. The way of walking, the place where he chose to lie, the way he watched you, in silence, as if I already knew, as if I had been there before, and maybe, deep down, you felt it. But he didn't speak, because it seemed impossible, because no one teaches us how to deal with this kind of thing. We learn to accept goodbyes. But no, continuities. But some connections do not follow simple rules. They don't end when the body ends. They do not disappear over time. They change, they adapt, they find other ways of existing. And maybe the bond between you and your dog never been just about this life. Maybe it was something bigger, something that started before and which continues afterwards. And that doesn't mean it came back exactly the same. It doesn't mean everything will be identical. But it means that what really mattered, the connection, the presence, the feeling, this can continue in subtle ways, in silent ways, but real enough to be felt. Now let me ask you one last question. If one day you met a gaze that made you feel exactly what you felt before, would you have the courage to recognize it, or would I let it go? Because it seems impossible. Because maybe, at some point in your life, this has already happened, and you didn't notice. Or did you realize and decided to ignore it? But the truth is, when the bond is real, he finds ways, even if we don't understand, even if the logic doesn't follow. And maybe the sound of pause you thought you had lost has not disappeared. Maybe he's just waiting for you to listen again. And if that made sense to you, tell me here in the comments. Have you ever felt that your dog found a way to come back? Or that, somehow, did he ever completely go away? Because when these stories start to appear, you realize you are not alone. And there is something much bigger connecting all of this. And if this video touched you in any way, maybe it's because that bond is still alive within you, and maybe always has been.